Okay, so this is your final project for me, dealing with PHP, MySQL, XML, and JSON, which we've covered quite a bit, and hopefully you have all learned something from my class. I sincerely hope you have. So the first thing that we're going to do to start this off is that in order to create an authentication table, we need to first get MySQL up and running. To get that, the command in Cloud9 is MySQL-ctl and install. I've already done this step, but once you have, it's going to take a second. It's going to install it. Then you're going to want to type in MySQL-ctl start. That's going to start it off. And then CLI, which is going to get us into the meat and potatoes of it. The first command you're going to type in, so let's do show databases. I've already done this, so you're going to see that I already have a database called auth on there. So you're going to do the same thing, create database auth. Once you type in that command, you're going to have a database called auth, so then say use auth, which is going to use that database. So now if I say show tables, it's going to show me I have one table in here, and that table is called authentication. Now, to create the correct table of authentication, here is the code. Create table authentication ID int of 10, not null, primary key auto increment. Now what this means is that it cannot be null, which is already true because it's auto incremented, which means it won't allow it. Same thing with primary key, but this is just to be extra specific. Auto increment means it starts off at 0 and it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Now an important point, if you use the delete command, if you say delete whatever identified by ID of 6, it'll delete it, but the auto increment is still going to be at position 6, so the next one that goes up will be position 7. So in your ID chart it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. That 6 will be deleted, but it will not go back. Once it increments, it stays incremented, basically. Next up is our username, which is a varchar 255, not null, no surprises there, hopefully. Password is the same thing. The 255 recommendation comes from PHP, which we will look at in just a second when we get into the password hashing. The created at is a date time. Now this is actually a quirk of MySQL 5.5 and below. In MySQL 5.6 and above, they fixed this, but 5.5 is what it uses, as you can see right here. Basically, it doesn't allow 2 timestamps. With this update at timestamp on update current timestamp is it tells it that whenever we use the update command, then it's going to automatically create a timestamp of update. But the first time through, this only works on update, by the way. The first time through, you actually need to add this manually, which we'll take a look at. Next up, we have a locked out, which is going to be a boolean, which in MySQL is tiny int. And basically this means that if they fail on this attempts part so many times, we're going to lock them out of the database and say that they need to contact someone to allow them back in. Finally, we have our email, which is going to be a varchar of 255. And then what happens if you screw this up? Well, if you screw this up, the first screw up that you can do is you can forget to add something. To add something into a table, you use the command alter table. You then specify what table you want to do, and then you use the keyword add, and you say, what do you want to add, and what are the properties of it you want to add. Now, the other more common screw up is that you realize you didn't add something that needed to be added. In this case, this next can be a little bit more funky. Everything looks fine up to here, and change makes sense, but what's this email? Well, in order to use the change statement, you must first specify the old name and then the new name you want to change it into. So obviously, if you're just intending on overwriting the old one, then you have to say the same name twice. Email, attempts, etc. And then you put in the definition. So rather than dropping the entire table and recreating it, this allows you to quickly alter it. The next command you're going to need to enter is this create user command, and it's going to be auth admin and then at localhost identified by ABC123. Which is the incredibly insecure password that you should never use in production, but we're using it here. What's also important is that we're using grant select insert delete update on auth asterisk. And what this means is that you can actually specify individual tables to give this person permission to. But in our case, we want to give this person permission on every table since we only have one. But we are restricting the permission to the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. So they do not have the ability to create new tables or truncate them or do anything else like that. And that's just a security risk, which I told you in class that you always want to give the minimum viable permissions to a user, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're making sure that from the web, the person has a minimal set of features they can use. Now, as far as Cloud 9 goes, they are going to be adding support for more robust database operations. So instead of doing this all from the command line, they'll have more features, but that's going to be coming up in an upcoming iteration. All right, so once again, those are the statements, and this is the one that you're going to need for the upcoming portion. Once you have that, the very first thing that we're going to need to work on is some sort of creating an account. So what I did here is I just made a little stylized box, and then there's going to be 4 fields that I know of that we're going to need, which is a username field, an email, and a password 1 and 2. And this is just because you never, want to accept a password from a user without first verifying that whatever password they use is correct. So you want to give them the chance to double authenticate it. Now, inside of here, when we look at our form, the pound sign there means submit to self. So it's going to submit to the create account page. That's why all this code is up here at top. Normally, I like to do my validations on an external page because, one, it makes the code more reusable because I can create functions in a separate page and include them. Here I'm doing it all inline, but you will see that this will violate what's called the dry principle. And dry equals do not repeat yourself. All right, keep your code dry. It means don't repeat yourself. But for now, we're going to be bad programmers and we're going to repeat ourselves. So then we have our doc type declaration, or HTML, and then I have this little if statement here, which is going to create the error class that I stylized up top. And for each error is error, it's going to echo out the error, create a break tag, and then when it's through looping through that, it's going to close out that div. So then we have our username, and for right now, I've commented out the HTML5 attributes, which are going to do the validation for us, but we're going to take a look at those in a second. For right now, we're getting rid of them because we want to make sure that our PHP works before we worry about our HTML, really our JavaScript and HTML and all the other good stuff. So they submit it, and we know that they submit it because on our input type submit, we give it a name of submit, and that's what we're going to be checking for. So if it's set, this post submit type, well then this gives us a couple of goodies. The number one thing it gives us is that all these other is set variables, we don't need to test for that anymore because we already know they're going to be set, because as soon as it posts it, everything with the name in the form is automatically set. But what we don't know is whether or not some of these things are going to be empty. And first we create an empty array called errors, because if any of this fails, then we want it to have errors. Now this is the ternary statement again, which means if it's not empty, then the username is going to be equal to strip tags post username. Now the reason why we're using strip tags is because the username is going to be displayed back to the user, and if they try injecting malicious code, we want to strip it out. And if not, then we're going to throw in errors. We're going to set this errors, this is the push basically, which is going to add one element to the end of the array. So at position 0, it's going to say no username. Likewise, we no longer need to use the isSet command. So if it filters and it validates as email, then the email is going to be equal to that. Else, we're going to put down errors that it's an invalid email type. We next do the post check on the password, and we say if it's got more or is equal to 6 characters, then the password is equal to that. Else errors, the password field must have at least 6 characters. Same thing with password check 2. And then if both of those pass, and so that means that both password and password 2 will now have fields, we're going to now compare them to each other. And if they don't match, then we're going to throw an error saying the passwords don't match. So those are all of our possible error conditions. Once that's gone, we're going to see if the errors array is empty. And if it is empty, if there's no errors inside of that array, then we're going to create a new MySQLi object, and we're going to set it to new MySQLi. And these values should be the same for me as for you, unless you change the password right there. But this is the order. Then we're going to check to see if there's any errors thrown on that, and if an error occurs whenever we try creating this object, it'll store it in that variable and we can echo that out. Else, we're going to run a query, and we're going to select all from authentication where username equals, and we need to put single quotes around username because this tells MySQL we're looking for a string. Without it, it's going to look for an integer of some type, and that would be completely wrong. So then we're going to run the query, and we're going to set our results equal to MySQLi affected rows. And if there is a number of results greater than 0, then we're going to throw an error that says the username already exists, please pick a new one. Else, if that works, then we're going to first create a password off the hash. So what this does is it takes a string, which in this case the user entered password, and then it's going to encrypt it using the password default, which if you read the PHP documentation for password hash, it's going to tell you, as of right now, the password hash gives you 60 characters by default, but make sure you have at least 255 because as PHP gets more and more versions, as they keep developing it, most likely the current 60 length might not be strong enough. So they're going to increase the encryption strength over time. So that's what this is telling you. So that's why we created this with 255 possible default values, even though this cannot exceed 60 characters. And then here's my little comment saying never store passwords as plain text. That's one of like the big security no-nos. Then we have a basic MySQL injection prevention, which is to use this real escape string method off the MySQLi object. Now what real escape string does is that the commands that are deadly to MySQL, the things like the backtick and the single and double quotes, it goes ahead and strips those out, or it uses the slash to comment them out. This is called basic MySQL injection prevention because it doesn't really verify what sort of thing is expected by MySQL. It just gives you some basic blanket injection prevention. So this is the basic stuff, but it's not the best stuff. The good stuff comes next. So then we say insert into Authentication Set. Now the way I like to use update and insert is I use this set version. I don't like to use the values version, mainly because this makes it very clear to me what values are being set. Now before I told you that MySQL 5.5 has a problem with the date timestamp. So using now is going to say whatever the time is right now, use that. And it's going to create a timestamp of that. And we want to keep a track of this because if someone says that they didn't update their user account and we look at it and we see that it was updated when they said it wasn't, then we know we have a problem. So this helps us keep track of things like that. And then finally we have our email field. In order to use this, we're using what's called a prepared statement, and it's a much stronger version than the sort of basic real escape string. And the reason why it's more powerful is because it checks with the MySQL database based upon this. So first we create a statement object and we set it equal to the object, which is MySQL prepare the query. Then we bind the parameters, and S means string, D means double, I means int. And basically this checks with the database and says what are valid parameters in this database for a string. What should a string look like? Or what should an integer look like? Or what should a double look like? And then only if what we submit to it passes that, will it allow it through. That's why it's much stronger, is because it's checking both the type and it's checking the data, rather than just applying a one-size-fits-all form of sanitation. Then we run the execute command, which is going to tell it that once it prepares and binds it, then executes it. And if it fails, it's going to return false. So if it fails, then we know that it failed, and we're going to output that as an error into our errors array. If it doesn't fail, then we're going to use the window.location from JavaScript, and we're going to pass in created user equals true, which gives us a way of creating a special message if they came in from the created account page. And here's our errors array. So here is the create new user. Let's submit it just by default. And here is our errors class, which has a white border and a little bit of shadowing around it to make that white border stand out against the white background, things like that. So it says no username, correct. Invalid email, correct. Password 1 must have at least 6 characters. Password 2 must have. So then we try Joe Smo, ABC 123, but then ABC 321, and email is Joe. And right here, I still have some HTML5 validation, so it just told me that that was still not quite up to snuff. So now when we submit this, it tells me my passwords do not match. But we can still see here Joesmo and joe@example.com are both still there. So this time I'm going to use the ABC123 on both of them. And now we see created user equals true because we passed that. And that creates this little message here that says log in with your new username and password. So thus far, thus good. And we saw how the errors worked, and we saw how all this validation worked. Which it looks confusing, but if you build it up bit by bit, it's not that confusing. It's only confusing when you do it all at once. Now, let's add in our HTML5 attributes. Well, first let's look at MySQL, and let's select all from authentication. And here we can see that Joe Schmo is now in our database. Now, an interesting thing to note about that password hash is that both of these passwords use ABC123, but they don't look very similar except for this part right here, which is the bcrypt string. This tells whatever password verifier you're using that it's a bcrypt algorithm. But because these algorithms are automatically known as what are salted, which means they automatically randomize them, even if everyone used the exact same password, you would never see a duplicate value in the database, which would make it really hard for anyone attempting to reverse it to be able to figure it out. Because one way hackers reverse engineer encryption algorithms is they look for repeating values, then they look for how often people use these particular passwords. So things like password 1, one of the most commonly used passwords, which is terrible. If that occurs, the most often frequently repeating hash, then they can make a pretty good guess that's password 1, and then the second most common password and third most common password, and eventually using that they will be able to reverse engineer everyone else's password from that list. So this prevents that from being a possible attack. So that's why we're using that, because it's very secure. Here we see the timestamps that we used. We're using the cur date, which gives the current date in this particular format. And so now if it gets updated in the future, this will automatically update to a new value, whereas our created at will be a different value. They are not locked out and they do not have any attempts yet. So all is well there. Now let's go back in and let's add our HTML5 attributes to our little form. That's good. This one's a little more interesting, so we'll talk about that whenever we get there. Glorious. Okay, everything looks like it's working correctly now. I think, let me go visit create account and make sure. Okay, all is well. So what's going on here? Well, what's happening here is that this pattern field, if we go to, which is right there, Rubular is a expression checker. And the expression checker that I'm using is first dot, which means any character, I don't care what it is. So dot. Then when I look over here, it tells me that if I want to make a 3 or more, then I use this syntax. Whatever characters I want to check, squiggly, our opening curly brace, the number minimum, comma, and then an empty value. So if I use it like this, then that means that I should only match if there are at least 6 items. So let's check it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we have a match. If we try it down below with just strings and numbers, we see it starts to match, and it'll match any number after that, but it must have a minimum of 6. So the HTML5 attributes is pretty limited as far as what it will check out of the box, but using this pattern checker, if you learn regexes, and I like Rubular because it's this little list right here is really nice just for a very basic quick check. this really allows me to see, and because I'm using the period operator, it's only matching, or this matches everything. If I was to use something else like that, then it would only match digits. So now it's only matching 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If I use it like this, it only matches non-digits. But those are both bad checks. For a password, you want them to be able to put absolutely anything into there. So that gives us that. Glorious. All right, so there's a login form. That's what our patterns are. Required is hopefully very easy to figure out. When I submit something, required says, please fill out this field. And let's put in ABC. Now this one's a little more interesting. You see how it says 6 characters minimum right here? If you do not put in a title, then the error message you're going to get back is going to be really crappy. It's going to say did not meet required form. It just says this part, please fill out this field. So let's do this, ABC, boom. It says please match the requested format. That's all it's going to say, which is terrible. That is an incredibly useless error message. So by putting in the title attribute, which you can see right there, you see these 6 characters minimum show up. So that gives them a little bit more information right there. And I'm using the ABC123 thing again, and mask my email keeps wanting to change my email address. But in this case, it'll be poorman@example.com. And we see our successful login. So that's using the HTML5 attributes, and this is just a nice little basic introduction to regular expressions to add a minimum check to your required password. And this one is checked automatically because we say it's type equals email, so it will not allow anything not an email to go through it. Okay, so now we have successfully used all the latest features in creating our first page. Now we have our login page. And the way this one's going to work is we're going to set our password, if it's been set, equal to the password, or else it's null. Username, same check, using the ternary operator. Now, if the value of created user has something in it, then it's going to say log in with your new username and password. Now we're running that isSet post check again. This one's going to be a little more in-depth. Well, not really. What we're doing here is we're just checking the username and password. And we have a little ahref, which allows them to create an account if they do not have one. Then what we do inside of here is we run that same MySQL check to see if they are available. If not, we tell them the error and we tell them what line it's on. So this __ line will print out the exact line number something goes wrong on, which is very useful whenever you have a lot of these, as it can be kind of hard to find out where things went wrong. So here we're using the basic check, so we're just escaping this username string. We should, if we were good developers, use the more strongly encrypted version of this, the more strongly authenticated version of this, or sanitized. But we're not doing that. We're being lazy. But this should still be just fine for our purposes here. So we say select username password from authentication where username equals the string username. Our result is going to be stored into a query, and the users found is going to be equal to the affected rows. And we use this because if it equals 0, then we're going to throw an error, and we're going to say we could not find a username for what you submitted, so your username must be wrong. If this result turns back to be okay, which by the way, even if there is nothing found, it's not this result will still come back true, because the only time this doesn't return something is if there's an error in this. So if I said select like username 2, for example, that would actually throw an error. But theoretically, this should still work actually no matter what. It's just going to return an empty object. Then we say while row equals fetch ASOC, so this is going to loop through the row, which should only return one item back to us, but just in case it doesn't, then it's going to keep looping through it, although I can never figure out a reason why it would ever do that. The only reason why would be, we already test for that condition, would be if we didn't have a check right here, which means there could be duplicate usernames. You can actually test for this in MySQL if you use the unique keyword, then that will tell MySQL that whatever values are stored for this particular row in the table cell, make sure that they're all different from each other. We're using PHP to validate this though. So then we're going to use the password verify. The password verify takes two arguments. The first one is the string you want to check, and then the hash string. So remember that whenever we look at MySQL, we have these hash strings stored as the password. So it's going to run a decryption check, and if the decryption matches, then the session start is going to be kicked off. The session is authentication is going to be true, and it should echo success. Otherwise, the error message is going to be displayed. It's going to say no password or password does not match our database. And then finally, if the username doesn't match, we're going to throw an error down there. So here we are. So first I have a username of ABC, and let me see actually, blah blah blah. So I have ABC, Joe Smo, and Billy Bob as my possible value. So I need to check all these conditions. So ABC, and it tells me no password or password does not match what's in our database. Let's try using a fake user like ABC. And it says we could not find a username for what you submitted. Exactly correct. So ABC and ABC123, and here we get the success message. So this worked. So now what we need to do is we need to actually do something useful with that information. So instead of echoing success, which is just a temporary check to make sure that all is well, instead we need to use the header file, the header argument, and we're going to specify our location as test.php. Please name it something better than that. This is because I was only testing out things. If we open up test.php, if the session is not authenticated, then it's going to redirect me back to the main page. So if I try visiting that, here it's letting me through because I am authenticated. Reload that, yep. I'm going to be stuck in a little bit of a loop there. So let me, actually this is a good point to point out this check. So right here, if empty errors for right now, what I also want to do is I want to make sure that my session is authenticated equals false. So if there's errors, then even if they were authenticated previously, we're now going to make sure they're not authenticated. And that's going to help us out. So let's go to login.php. Notice that whenever I hit this without the other checks, no password or password does not match. Let's go to test.php and let's see if it kicks me out. Nope, it still thinks I'm authenticated. Oh. I'm betting that's because I need to put that right there. Let's see if that is correct. Well, that is exactly what I didn't want to have happen. Okay. Now let's visit test.php, and there it is. It kicks me out. The reason why this failed was because my session start was down here, which then allowed me to set the session variable, but it only happened if all this worked. So whenever I tried setting the authenticated to false, because the session was never started, now it is, but because it was never started, setting this to false didn't do any good. So now it's working as expected. Only if they pass everything will it be set to correct. And it's going to automatically, once I try going there, so if I'm not logged in, boom, I go right back out. And in fact, we can improve this just a little bit more by saying not authenticated equals true. Then we go to login. You see here we have this if is set. Let's run another one of not authenticated and echo. Please log in before attempting to access our database. Alright, so now theoretically what should happen is I get this not authenticated equal to true, and it's going to tell me that I should log in before attempting to access the database. So now someone who's not authenticated does not have any access to the database. They're just going to keep getting kicked out But if they do pass it, then they are going to be authenticated, and they're going to be able to see the back end, or whatever information we choose to display to them. So now that's all working. Remember to go to my Cloud9 if you want to see what's going on inside of here. And just so you can see how all this works, links to share, the correct link is the one right there. And only I have read-write permissions, so don't even try it. Alright. Alex. Anyway, so that's our login. We have that. Now the last thing is the very unfortunately named test.php. So that first kicks you out. The second thing that we're using, though, is something new. I haven't shown you this before, but I think now is a great time to demonstrate it. It's what's called a here doc or a now doc. And what this does is that first you specify with 3 opening braces or 3 less than symbols. You specify what it is that you want to have be the demarcator. In this case, I'm saying it's XML. The demarcator must be with no white space before it on a single line by itself with a semicolon to terminate it. So that tells it that this is all going to be XML. Do not attempt to parse this as PHP. That's basically what it tells it. It tells it that whatever I put inside of here, just let it be. And that's very useful whenever you're creating large amounts of text that you do not want PHP to attempt to parse. And that's exactly what happens here. Likewise, this XML starting thing must also have no white space. That's just an XML thing, not a PHP thing. So these two things must have no space in between them. Then what I'm using is I'm creating this new simple XML iterator, and I'm passing in the string value, which is everything in between the 2 opening and closing XML documents. Now, if you had Java with me, then we just talked about iterators, and iterators are basically special objects that iterate over other objects. And basically they are performance optimized to be able to read over them. So first we create a simple XML iterator, which is an iterator designed for just XML. Then we have the slightly more confusing iterator called recursive iterator. And an iterator is an iterator that iterates over other iterators. Yeah, I know. I know. But that's what it is. And it's recursive, which means that no matter how many depth there is to this iterator, it's going to be perfectly fine. It's going to keep going. So in a normal case, you have to write a bunch of for each loops, like for each first index in an array, for each second index in an array, for each third index in an array, so forth and so on. A recursive iterator gets rid of that. It will infinitely loop through it up until such point as it runs out of memory or times out, or you have other issues like that. So then what I'm doing is I'm printing out the item, I'm printing out what the depth is, and then it's all inside of a bold tag. Then I'm using strict tags key and strict tags item because you should always sanitize output. Just like we filtered the input and what was coming in and making sure that it met all of our requirements, we should also make sure that we always sanitize our output, because we can't be 100% certain that the XML we're receiving from an outside source is going to be free of malicious code. So we should always make sure that we sanitize our output. Then we print out a PHP end of line and a break tag. And when we look at that, here's what we get. So for the first level, always these things have a recursion depth of 1 because the only parent object they have is this inventory object. So article and all of its IDs have a recursion depth of 1. This one also has a recursion depth of 1 until we get to this one, which has a recursion depth of 2. Right? Because it's inside of this other article tag. So then we have a depth of 2 right here as well, but then a 3 when we get to this article. So all these have a recursion depth of 3. And when we look at it, that's exactly what we see. The first set only has a recursion depth of 1, second set has a recursion depth of 2, and then the third set has a recursion depth of 3. So this is just a mock-up of what someone might see on a back-end database, and I'm just mocking it up for right now. But the main things, the big takeaway points from all of this, oh, we need to do something else here. Haha, we're not done yet. So right here, I'm just printing out any errors, but actually that's wrong. What I really need to do, queries equals update, and what do I need to update? Update attempts. Update authentication. So here what we need to do first is we need to get attempts equals row attempts. And first we'll run an is null because this can't have a null value. And if it is null, it equals 0, else it equals row attempts. Since this is an integer, we do not need to put it inside of single quoted strings. So update authentication set attempts equals pound attempts, where username equals, now we need the string, where username equals username. And actually this needs to be a 1. And we'll put, actually, we'll use this version of it, the pre-increment version. So attempts equals plus plus, so if this is 1, it'll now be 2, 3, 4, so forth and so on. Only if it's null does it get set to 1 as its default. So if we were going to make this in the most readable way possible, update authentication set attempts equals attempts, where username equals username. And then we throw an error. Now we need to have one other check, and that is if attempts equals 5. Or actually, let's do it this way. If attempts is greater than or equal to 5. Then our new query is going to be equal to set locked out. I think that's the correct spelling. Yep. Equals 1, where username equals pound username. And we'll run the else query. If that turns out not to be true, and let's line it up so that way it's a little bit easier to read. There we go. So first we're going to check the attempts, and if it's null we're going to set equal to 1, else we're going to add 1 to whatever value is currently in there. If they've had more than 5 attempts, then we're going to set it to locked out. And that means that we need to add one more check into here, locked out, because now while we're running our row check, we need to say if row, and that should be enough because it only can be a 1 or a 0. 0 or null would be false. So if locked out, we're going to put an error in here, and errors equals this account is locked, contact administration. And then we're going to say return false. The reason why we're returning false, well, we could use a break statement. That should also work. Basically what that's going to do is that we're inside of a loop right here, We can get out of this loop one of two ways, by using a break statement or by using a return statement, either which one would get us out of everything. I'm going to use the break statement, but the return statement is generally a better choice because the break statement is only going to throw me out of this while loop, and then it's going to continue on with everything not part of this while loop, so everything else. But that should be enough to never have it try to send me to the correct address. Alright, now let's go to our login page and let's see. Well, let's actually make it just even a little bit better. We can do better than this even. First thing we do that will make this a little bit better is we can define max attempts. We're going to set that equal to 5. Now why are we doing this? Max login attempts. Because we want to eliminate what are known as magic numbers. And you can see here that we have a magic number, less than or equal to 5. Right? It's not exactly clear what that is, but max login attempts is immediately clear what that number is. So I like that a lot better. This is what constants were meant for, is the elimination of any sort of magic variable like this. Alright, so now what we want to have happen is we want to make sure that our errors message, we're not displaying errors at this point. We're also not running our query. My goodness, look at me. Pound MySQL query, pound query. For these updates, you don't need to do anything else to them, because as soon as you run the query, it's executed. So now we're running our queries, and what else do we need to do is, in this case, we need to throw an error message. So now, if they try logging out and logging back in, it's still going to be locked and it's going to display a message, else the errors are right here. And now what we need to say is pound errors. And what this should do is it should subtract from that until it gets down to 0. So let's see if all this good stuff worked. So we have ABC. It did not do what I wanted it to do there. I'll try it like that version and see if that works any better. Getting there, but it's still not quite what I want. For some reason it's not echoing out. Oh. Equals, no, it should be doing this. Yeah, that doesn't really make any sense. Because normally what you would do is, this is the perfect case for when you would use something like this, because that would then tell it, and what don't you like. Try this. This should fix all the problems. So what I'm going to do here is typecast it to an integer and see if that alleviates the problem. And first, let's make sure my variable names are correct. How about now? You only have 2 attempts left. There we go. Now it seems to be working correctly. You only have 1 attempt left. You are locked out of the account. Contact administration. Now the real test here, well, I'm going to put in the correct password, ABC123. Up, it failed. That's not good. Yep, it did not update the locked out permission. That query never ran. So let's find out why it did not run. Set locked out equals 1, where username, run the query. Yeah, it never goes up to 5 actually, so I do have a logical error. What is my logical error? And I think that it's this right here. Because it says greater than or equal to. And because I'm using the pre-increment here, I'm thinking that's actually making it fail before it hits 5. So let's try this one more time. You have 0 attempts left. There it goes. And I think this one should work. But let's find out. It hit 5, but my locked out is still equal to null. And it's because I'm stupid. Okay. Here is the problem. Whenever you are passing in a string, you must have those single quotes, which I do have them right here. If you don't have them right there, then it will simply not execute that command. So let's try this once again. It tells me I'm locked out, but now I am actually locked out. So even if I pass now, it still tells me the account is locked and I need to contact administration. So as you can see, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. A whole lot of things. Now, one thing that we can do to help alleviate this particular problem is that if we have an invalid query, we can try to capture it, and I think this should capture it. Let me check it. Since the account's now locked, I don't know if it'll ever execute that command. It doesn't. But if I go into here, and I'll use the update authentication set attempts equal 0, comma locked out equals 0, where username equals ABC. And now I'm not locked out, but There I have my 4 attempts left. Go back into here. It'll take me a couple of tries to get it to go, but 3, 2, 1, 0, and here's the error message. Unknown column, ABC, and where clause on line 43. So when I look at 43, boom. And it's telling me that it doesn't know what ABC is because it's not quoted as a string. But now whenever I quote it as a string, it should be able to understand that it wants me to lock out of the account. So there's my error. I had initially thought the error was because of this pre-increment operation that it was only going up to 4, which it was. But that's perfectly fine for now. So this is the ability to remove magic variables. That's why we use constants. For some reason it didn't let me subtract the constant the way I would want. I'm thinking that maybe if I use this int val conversion, let's see if this will work for me. Rerun that command. Will it blend? 4, 3, yep, there was the error. So this is one of the annoying things about PHP being weakly typed, is that in cases where you want to do math sometimes, you're going to need to use the int val to force it to understand that you're attempting to do math right here. In my case, it was actually acting as if I wanted to do a string concatenation, and it was acting haywire. So I can get rid of this now. So anyway, now I have a locked out check. I have a correct administration check. I now know that it works, and now I know if I submit it, then it takes me into here. I need to do one other thing, and that is what happens if they successfully log in. Well, we need to run a few more queries. And in this case, it's going to be set attempts equal to 0. So we're going to reset the attempts if they manage to log in. So let's go back to login. ABC has failed previously, so now it should be at 1 attempts. Now we're going to log in successfully, and then we're going to go back, login.php. Let's fail it, and it should put us back to the top. There we go. So now we have a robust login system that authenticates people, it keeps everything from showing, and it does exactly what we expect it to do. So that is your final project. You must create a authentication of some system. I also want you to stylize it in some manner. You have my URL so you can check out the code and make sure it doesn't work. Be sure you use the php.net website. You will be graded based upon the following. Everything I've went over, of making sure that there is some sort of authentication system, that there is password encryption, that you have some sort of lockout feature, that you also have some sort of reset for it, that you have multiple password fields to check it, that you check the length of the password fields, that you understand how to use the HTML5 attributes, and also some of the newer ones which probably weren't introduced to you in the original course. All of these things will be added, and especially that once it's all said and done, you have some sort of either XML or JSON based document that you're then going to display to the user, which will then indicate that you have successfully learned XML, JSON, and MySQL, plus of course the non-standard but highly useful PHP that we have been using this entire course. So I hope that answers all of your questions. Send me an email if you have difficulties with something.